whatever you do, don't fall asleep.
A Nightmare on Elm Street is an all-time favourite movie series for me, but it's kind of a weird inclusion in that I acknowledge its problems such as being vastly dated and not particularly scary in comparison to today's modern horror film standards. Though with that being said, I'd say it's a hell of a lot scarier than a few certain other horror movies we've been getting lately. La Llorona, and The Nun. Shit, we just get some shit sometimes. Yeah, no, all the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, even the dumbest ones, always scarier than those movies. But despite whatever other people may take issue within this series overall, like for instance the fact that Freddy Krueger quickly and increasingly becomes more of a parody of himself than an intimidating villain from film to film, I absolutely love it, and in fact find these inherent flaws and weird creative choices tremendously charming. The shitty yet admirable practical effects acting as set pieces for each kill, the dumber and dumber ways that they keep finding ways to bring Freddy back, and of course the more and more elaborate ways in which the dreams within the film manifest and become cinematic gems. This series is insane, at times very stupid, and even legitimately creepy and clever at times too. With Wes Craven's new Nightmare, for instance, even after all it had been throughout the series, it still managed to bring itself back on track and become, to an extent, scary again. The Elm Street series has seen it all and has morphed into quite a few different variations in terms of tone and quality.
Okay, asshole. Let's dance.
It's far from a perfect series, but there's this charm to it, this certain respectability. Look, the point after all this is that I have a particular love for the Nightmare on Elm Street series, and so I wanted to make a video that revolves around them. And so I recently binged through a bunch of the series, finishing it off with the classic Freddy vs. Jason. And just, geez, let me tell you, it's kind of a strange movie. This is a movie that would not get made today. It's a bit of an enigma. There are continuity questions to be raised, differences in the different eras of these movies that don't quite line up perfectly, and I just have a whole bunch of thoughts that I had while rewatching. So today, well, I'm gonna talk about that a bit. Freddy vs. Jason isn't by any means really classic cinema. This isn't a movie that gets talked about a whole lot nowadays. This probably isn't really anybody's favourite movie of all time either. So why am I talking about it? Well, I think that it can be actually used as an interesting lens, allowing us to look at the time it was made and the state of horror movies then, particularly slasher movies as they were. You know, your typical invincible slasher movie was starting to reveal itself to be on its last legs of being in the mainstream. The classic icons of Freddy, Jason, Michael Myers and the like were all in their nearly tens of entries into their respective franchises and starting to feel a bit rusty. And little did we know, but for a lot of these characters barring Chucky, who somehow stayed within the same continuity until earlier this year, they were all about to be rebooted and rebranded in years to come to varying degrees of success. The fact was that horror was changing. The fun silliness that we'd all come to love from these sorts of franchises were kind of starting to die out. Yeah, no, instead when we hit the 21st century, we all decided that everything had to be dark and gritty, and so that's when the reboots started coming through. And what came with it were movies that were also trying to be taken more seriously and try to be, you know, more realistic. The most obvious and influential example that I could come up with was Saw in 2004. This was definitely a movie that sparked a whole bunch of other movies after it that were all part of the torture porn genre. This was something that was really popular from that 2004 to, I don't know, 2008 or something era, where the Saw movies especially obviously had great, crazy success. And then there were the arguable copycats like Hostel. Saw very much sprouted a looked down upon genre. The other sort of genre that defined that era of horror was the found footage genre, which of course Paranormal Activity didn't invent, it didn't start it, but it popularized it heavily. Paranormal Activity was really the one to make the found footage approach come to fruition. Again, this was another movie that sprouted a bunch of copycats and a bunch of other shitty found footage horror movies. But again, no denying this was a staple of that era from 2007 to 2014 maybe? around that. But I guess the more relevant example to speak about here is 2003's Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake, which came out, funnily enough, the same year as Freddy vs. Jason. And with that being said, it's funny because here we have two movies that were similar in terms of context and past cinematic histories, but were applied very, very differently and had these very crazy different tones. One was this silly, fun throwback, while the other was trying to be more, well, taken seriously, and successfully so. Freddy vs. Jason kind of reflects a fun time before horror changed so drastically, despite arguably trying to do the opposite. I don't think the film itself intended to come off as stupid, as we can see with the dramatized scenes between the main teenage group and the heavy focus on them as actual characters. I think this movie in one way or another did have a bit of an identity crisis. It was trying to bring back stuff from the past, all the while trying to revamp and be updated for the youth of today. And maybe that's why Freddy vs. Jason turned out to be the last for both of the series. It feels really bizarre within the context of the stories in the film that this is where their paths end. I don't think Freddy vs. Jason was planned to be an endpoint for these characters, but kind of did play a part in it, along with horror's popularity heading in a different direction. But because of that, this movie feels like it's really the end of an era. It's a strangely placed movie forever trapped in horror iconic limbo, but it signified what these movies were and had become. It was intentionally pulpy, over the top, and ended up serving exactly what was intended, but ultimately maybe killed both franchises in their entirities. This strange movie that's kind of stuck between both trends of time, as it tries to be this modern, like this really cool example of what we were capable of at the time, which we can see with the CGI blood splatters in the title and the alt-rock kind of soundtrack and everything. This was really a movie that was trying to be as cool as possible, yet while still hanging on to its last roots of the 1980s. And in that way, it kind of feels like an old guy trying to stay relevant by using like terms that are not cool anymore, terms from like 5 years ago, like fucking YOLO or something like that. But in that, it kind of makes it endearing as well. It's like, kind of laugh at it, but I mean, it was obviously also going for something that was a bit more fun, so there's something to appreciate in the tone here. I don't know if it fully succeeded in what it was intending to do, but the fact that it came out just like it did, well, it brought me something to appreciate. I find it interesting in that after 20 odd years of these movies showing up and making enough money to justify more and more entries, this is where it ended. This was the last time Robert Englund embodied the iconic character, and the last in the series for Jason before his new and arguably or not improved reincarnation in 2009, followed by Freddy's the next year. Both of which are movies I enjoyed to an extent, but perceive both to lack the charm of their predecessors. Though perhaps well intended to slip back into a darker tone and attempt for genuine fright, there's something clearly missing in these later remakes, and that's a sense of joy. As weird as that sounds for movies about serial killers, the movies of the 80s and 90s were fun. There's also something to admire in the writing of this movie, for as silly as it all is, there's a sincerity to the villain's actions and motivations. The plot runs true to both of their previous setups, and the worlds within the films come together surprisingly well, for being focused on pretty different things in terms of structure and how each villain goes about what he does. What I'm saying is that, as dumb as it is, the fact that we all need this to work to justify these characters doing something so cliche as killing random teenagers, well, it still manages to stay somewhat focused, with a good share of screen time for each character. Freddy feels at his most cartoonishly evil, representing the cunning brains of the two, and Jason presents an epic lump of a dead guy coming back to wreak havoc in a weirdly, seemingly innocent way. He's the dumb, gullible brawn. The dynamic works and the conflict works. Freddy is manipulating Jason to bring him back to mindlessly kill, so that the town of Springwood assumes that Freddy is actually back and killing people, thus Freddy gaining power throughout the fear of his victims. And that follows along with the logic of these characters that we've seen in previous films. It adds up. But then Jason, of course, ends up taking all the kills, which leads Freddy to get pissed off and wanting to take him down. It's kind of like a territorial fight, and it might be simple and kind of dumb, but it's a logical way to bring these characters together and to turn them against each other too. While I'm kind of praising stuff though, let's get to something that I kind of really wanted to talk about that I really love, even though it really should not be in a good movie. And I guess that's why it's here, right? Because Freddy vs. Jason, it's a great movie, fuck you. But this aspect to the movie that I found hugely compelling, where there's a few examples where it's clear that Freddy Krueger, within the movie, they kind of don't know what to do with him, so that he just stops and kind of looks at the camera and literally just says what he's thinking. He tells us exactly what's going on within the plot, what he needs to do, his motivations. He just explains stuff.
Not strong enough yet. Well, I will be soon enough.
Freddy conveniently narrates and exposits a bunch of information out loud as he talks to himself for absolutely seemingly nobody but for the audience to hear. And it's so dumb and I love it. You wouldn't get that in a movie today. Not in a serious movie, that is, anyway. Yeah, so that's definitely one of my favorite funny kind of dumb parts of this movie, but I wanted to get to explaining the reason behind it because there's actually a real life reason for this. Freddy vs. Jason was years in the making. It was teased early on and talked about for years and years, but nothing could ever form from it. So let's discuss the rocky road that led the way. The studio behind the film didn't quite believe in it early on, and it took the main writers, Damien Shannon and Mark Swift, a whole load of convincing and pushing. And just imagine, by the way, what that's like, pitching this potentially confusing idea of combining characters that have nothing to do with each other. There was a slim chance of this movie ever getting made. Point is, after many disputes between things like an R rating and a dumbed down PG-13 rating, character motivations, and a supposed half-hour too long script, the film finally got greenlit, but not without compromise. As the story goes, the script consequently got 3 more rewrites done by David S. Goyer to trim it down as much as possible, but this left major plot holes and logistical gaps, which only makes sense because narratives are like a building or a bridge or some sort of regulated infrastructure, and that often such a thing will only work as a whole. Once you start taking pieces out, you're going to lose foundations, you're going to be missing things that were clearly meant to be there. And if that's bad enough, the whole thing is ultimately going to collapse. Like, I've seen that in my own work. When editing through a video and I decided like to cut a line because it sounds dumb or to save myself time, but then I realized that I referenced what I just said in the part that I want to cut later in the video, which correlates to a further point. So only including the later part wouldn't make any sense. The option then becomes cut both or keep both. It's a frustrating process sometimes, and a fictional narrative would be much the same. Once some form of information is established, you write the rest of the piece with that assumed knowledge. And if you don't pay attention to what you've cut, you're going to have major logical gaps. And this is what happened with Freddy vs. Jason, resulting in needing Freddy to explain shit, which is why he ends up talking to the camera. Which, look, in the final cut of the film, kind of does come off as condescending and completely unnecessary, but for me as a film fan, as I'm watching, I just find it super charming, and I don't know, I kind of like to laugh at it, so I'm super okay with it. It's kind of one of my favorite parts. It's cheesy, corny, campy, fun, and I can get behind that. But let's jump back in time a bit. After the initial pitch for the characters to face off was made in 1987 following Jason Lives, Freddy vs. Jason was left only an implication, as it spent the next decade and more in form of only a dream. Development hell kept it on the brink of being made and being scrapped for quite a few years, as it was put on hold for rights issues. Both owning companies, that of New Line for Krueger and Paramount for Jason, were even willing to come to an agreement, and the initial idea was that one of the companies would have access to temporarily borrow the other's property, and that being one of the respective characters, and put them in their own film so that neither had to give up the rights permanently. But of course, an agreement as to the plot, which company would take which character, and most likely screen time could never be made. This is an assumption, but I'm also guessing it became a bit of a childish campaign to convince the other of letting up the rights to their opponent's character, which never turned out for either party. Anyway, as the history went, after this failure, this still non-existent movie kept coming up with no results. Thusly, both companies resorted to making further sequels in their own franchises, resulting in some very poorly received films, as what came out were arguably quick cash grabs. And with 1989's Jason Takes Manhattan, the death of Paramount's ownership begun, and eventually Jason's rights were finally sold to New Line, meaning that Freddy vs. Jason finally had some chance of existence, and the original Friday the 13th director, Sean S. Cunningham, could get to work on trying to make his fantasy get made. Ironically or not though, at about the same time, something else was coming up with New Line Cinema, and that was A Nightmare on Elm Street's creator, Wes Craven, deciding to come back. And of course, he wanted to make a new movie with Freddy. This became 1994's New Nightmare, which also resulted in Freddy vs. Jason being put on hold because Wes Craven was the big name, and, doing a just straight up Nightmare on Elm Street movie with him was the safer bet. He was the priority, rather than this risky, kind of weird Freddy vs. Jason idea. So they put that on hold, and of course went with the safe bet and went to work with Wes Craven, because you're not going to say no to that. It's also notable to mention that A Nightmare on Elm Street was still quite a fruitful franchise. Like, it was kind of dying out, but it was still making money as of the last movie that came out. But as for Friday the 13th, that was like drastically failing. They were just losing money. So yeah, at the time it was a no-brainer. A Nightmare on Elm Street was the way to go. So desperately trying to throw one out there in an attempt to keep Friday fans' interest, Cunningham chucked out another cash grab of an entry in Jason X, which was also put on hold for a couple of years and didn't come out till 2001 for its own issues, which ended up having one of the highest production costs for a film in the series and yet gained the least incoming box office to date, losing them a shit ton of money. While these films were in production though, and the following years, New Line, now with the rights to both characters, hadn't forgot about the potential movie to be made. Draft after draft were written and sold, reportedly $6 million worth, but all were scrapped. One of the drafts that was apparently written combined some of the characters from Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th, and then it somehow, this same script led up to Freddy and Jason fighting in hell for the approval of the devil or some shit, which kind of sounds amazing. I'm a bit disappointed that's not the script we got, but oh well. Another potentially had Jason on trial for his crimes, for all his murders, like in court, which again sounds great. And another notable potential one that they were going to make had it so that they retconned Freddy Krueger's story and made it so that he was originally a Camp Crystal Lake counselor and was the cause pretty much of Jason Voorhees' death, which I actually think is actually a pretty cool idea. I'm kind of into that one, but again, that's not what we got. But yeah, it seems like there was about 1,000 different directions that this movie could have gone in. Anyway, they finally got a pitch that everyone could agree on. Writers Damian Shannon and Mark Swift swooped in with their own take, later stating, "We had a very strong take from the beginning on what the movie should be and what it shouldn't be. We came from a place where we didn't want to change the backstories at all. We didn't want to throw out the other movie. We wanted everything to count. We pitched what we as fans would want to see." Through a few more problems and controversies, such as the casting of Jason getting changed, being a major gripe that many fans of the series have with this film, Freddy vs. Jason had finally become a tangible, watchable, physical thing. It finally existed. But again, of course, not without its criticisms. The critical consensus came in form of, this was clearly intended for the fans. Big fans of these characters and movies were satisfied and the epic showdown that was promised was finally fulfilled. But even fans had their issues, resulting in a few arguments, such as some argue about whether this feels more like a Friday the 13th movie with Freddy Krueger making a cameo, while others feel like it's more like a Nightmare on Elm Street movie with Jason simply in it. I fall more into the latter personally. I think the tone of it all, the one driving the plot, is Freddy, and he feels like the main antagonist here, and that only makes sense since this was a New Line film. I know I'm okay with it because I'm a massive Elm Street fan, less so a Friday the 13th fan, though still has great moments. I'd consider myself a fan, but I think that Elm Street was more creative and willing to go the extra mile in terms of set designs and kills. I'm a much bigger fan of that. That's just my preference. There's also an argument to be made that this film tries to make it so that Jason is canonically afraid of water itself, which many found stupid. I will explain that in my opinion though, and this is what the writers have said themselves. I view it more as water is more meant to be symbolic for his fear of drowning, and the scene in question is presented in a nightmare sequence, water playing as a representation of said fear, and that makes sense to me. There's also whether or not Jason should be portrayed as sympathetic, which he arguably is very much so in this movie, despite the fact that he is a cold-blooded and irredeemable killer. To which I say, fuck it, it's a fun horror movie, don't think too hard about it. Just chill about some of the extra details here and there, you know? Which is a pretty ironic thing to say when we are neck deep in a deep analysis of a 17-year-old movie by me. I shouldn't tell people not to think about things too much. Clearly an example of that. But anyway, the only thing that this does, in my opinion, is humanize him, which is far from a bad thing. I think that we definitely need more of that kind of thing with our villains in horror movies, in everything. Humanizing a villain is only a good thing. But he is irredeemable in the end, so I kind of see where everybody's coming from. And the last thing I wanted to mention was the end of the movie, where it remains ambiguous as to who wins. To which I'll revert back to the writers of the film once more as they make their argument. We don't think the ending plays like a cop-out. The intention was always for the ending to be a Rorschach test for fans. Freddy fans would think Freddy won, and Jason fans would think Jason won. Freddy vs. Jason plays as a relic of its time. It's stuck between the past and the future and wants to be all things in between. Yet it kind of works for me. Freddy vs. Jason is all things dumb, charming, and even effectively horrific all at the same time. It plays its part in serving its simple story, it weaves well between the characters that beforehand had nothing to do with each other, and it lived up to the expectation in one way or another. Whether or not it's a fantastic movie regardless. This movie's funny, I guess it's kind of scary, it's really silly, I like how cheesy it is. I've got a soft spot in my heart for this movie. There is a sense of some sort of magic that I don't see being rekindled ever again, really. At least not in the same way. This was a movie that had the soul of a decade prior, but a look and attitude trapped in the early 2000s, and was very much a product of All Things Considered. Okay, cool. So if you're still watching this and everything, thanks so much. I know this is like a longer video than normal, but I just thought it was kind of an interesting enough topic to talk about. I'd rewatched some of the movies and I got a bit consumed. I was doing some research and I was like, yeah, I'm super into this story about how it got made and everything, which of course branched on to just the state of horror at the time. And yeah, so I was kind of excited to talk about this kind of stuff. Hopefully you were interested. Thanks for watching again. Do all the shit, like, comment, share, subscribe, all that shit, whatever. That's all. Yep, cool. Goodbye.